Alrighty, my clock's ticked over to 10:30, so I think we'll get started. In the interest of keeping things on time and moving through, I've got a lot of Zoom meetings that I'm hosting today. This is this is the 10:30 session with Ros McMillan. Ros is an honorary senior fellow in arts education in the University of Melbourne, following her retirement after 11 years as the head of music education there. She's had a long and distinguished career in teaching music. In 2019, she was awarded an AM in the Queen's Birthday Honours. Garry Greenwood lived in Launceston and made leather instruments. Karlin Love, who's also a presenter at this conference, has composed for and played many of the instruments. The title of Ros's presentation is A Tasmanian Legend, Garry Greenwood's Gift to Music Making. Thanks, Ros.
Thank you, Wendy. Just setting ourselves up here. Thank you. I'm delighted to be able to present a paper on one of Australia's and Tasmania's greatest creative artists. And I'm really sorry not to be presenting this in Tasmania because there are so many admirers there, and also because we were going to have Tasmanian musicians playing Garry's instruments live, and that would have been fantastic. However, first, I want to acknowledge the work of the ASME Conference Organising Group. We owe an enormous thanks to Wendy Ross, the convener, to Paul Radford, the chair of Tasmania ASME, to Andrea Marks, the immediate past president, and to Jenny Rosevear, the national treasurer. We know that you have had the most extraordinary journey getting to this point, and we're incredibly indebted to you for forging ahead to make sure that this conference exists. It's all been voluntary work, of course, as it is for all of us who are associated with our chapters for ASME all around Australia, and we do it for the love of music education and its importance in Australia. So thank you very much, Conference Organising Group. Back to Garry. He was known worldwide for his extraordinary work with leather. Garry was living in Launceston until his untimely death in 2005. There he is, up at Mount Barrow, which is out of Launceston, up in the mountains, with the little hoppies. The hoppies mother was killed, and about 10 of them were brought up to Garry and Lynn, his partner, and they rehabilitated them, and the hoppies gradually disappeared into the forest. But you can see what a beautiful setting it was if they can be sitting with their back to Garry Greenwood. Garry arrived in Australia from England in 1962, and he established the Bowbank Mill Gallery in Deloraine in 1973, which he directed until 1985. He was the head of leather workshop in the Canberra School of Art then for 4 years. He held over 30 solo exhibitions throughout Australia and internationally, and won numerous awards. His work, because it's so artistic as well as beautiful sounding, is in 40 public collections throughout the world. And his instruments were in private collections, amongst others, the late Barry Tuckwell and the late Don Burrows. Both had Garry's instruments. Now, Garry's interest in making musical instruments began with an appreciation of the design of stringed instruments and a desire to capture their qualities. And so he made these wonderful non-sounding instruments in exaggerated shapes and colours, made all out of leather, perhaps cutting them off at the bottom so that they could sit on a stand, and in colours as diverse as lipstick pink and black. And then he became interested in the possibilities of the sound of these. So thinking about instruments generally, the first ones he made were leather drums, wonderful sounding. And then he made stringed instruments and then wind instruments. And when it came to wind, he reasoned that they were basically a tube through which air passed. So the first of these was a set of bowhorns named for their shape, which is similar to the bow used to shoot an arrow. And in a moment I'll show you a picture of one of those. So from those bowhorns he made a huge range of leather instruments, ranging from ocarinas out of leather, which he called poco pods, to wind instruments with fabulous names such as dragon bassoons, until the last instruments that he made, which he called mountain harps. I'm going to show you a photograph of the poco pods. Now, earlier this year at the Queen Victoria Gallery in Launceston, an exhibition was held of Garry's work called Skin. And there are the poco pods up on the wall, little leather poco pods. Garry actually said they were amongst the most difficult instruments he had to make, perhaps because of their round shape, I don't know. But when you blow them, they make that lovely ocarina sound, that very gentle sort of too sound. Now, I hadn't seen this before, but at the exhibition it was set up so that you could stand on the 8 pedals, as you can see below, each pedal related to one of the poco pods. And if there were 2 of you and you were smart and could sort of synchronize yourself, you could almost play a little duet on them. They all had a single note, though strangely one of them had several notes. I can't remember what they were, but when you stood on the pedal, it made a sound like doo, 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 over and over again. Just gorgeous, and they're so pretty to look at too. Here is something that we're not quite sure of the name. Now, Wendy mentioned Karlin Love, who became associated with Garry in 1993 and knows more about his instruments than anybody else. So I asked Karlin what the name of this instrument was. It was also in the exhibition, and she said she took a guess at dual horn, but she wasn't too sure because the gallery had held it long before 1993, and under an old curatorial policy, it was not allowed to be played. But we've given it the name dual horn because it's got a place for 2 trumpet mouthpieces. Now, you'd have to be very friendly to play so closely together, but it would be fascinating to hear it played. And apparently, according to Karlin, it's lined with cling wrap. Here is one of the last instruments he made. He called this mountain harps, and it is all leather except for the bowl. And Garry found that the leather collapsed under the weight of the strings and the whole top piece. You can see at the top there are pegs. They're both banjo pegs and harp pegs, and all leather all the way down to its little legs. There are strings, a variety of strings that end up in, I guess, little O-holes, I guess they're probably called. Interestingly, underneath the bowl is a drum skin, so that if you pluck a note and then use your hand underneath to stroke the drum head, you can vary the sound. The instrument can be bowed, it can be plucked, something can be put on the strings and can be slid down, so it can make a glissando. Just a beautiful, beautiful instrument. And they've really summed up how beautifully Garry composed things. The instruments today are played by the Tasmanian Leather Orchestra. So I suggest after this, it would be fascinating, you will find it fascinating, to go into the website and just click on Tasmanian Leather Orchestra and hear some of the sounds they make. And also click on Karlin Love and the Chordwainers. That is the group that she runs. And they all play Garry's instruments with some terrific music. So both of those, check them out after this, Tasmanian Leather Orchestra and Karlin Love and the Chordwainers. Now, central to my paper is the story of a remarkable collaboration between another great Australian creative artist, Brian Brown, and Garry. Brian was the head of improvisation at the Victorian College of the Arts, and he founded the course in 1980, and his philosophy was that in the course the students should develop a personal voice. And this came about because he began his first quartet in 1956, and in 1958 they recorded a piece called Milestones, which is a very famous Miles Davis piece, and that was in 58. Now, a young man who was doing a PhD on improvisation came to interview Brian and asked him how was it that they were playing Milestone in 58 when the LP did not come out into Australia till 1961. And that was because Brian had a friend in New York who would post him LPs as soon as they were released. Brian would listen to the music, transcribe it, and his quintets and quartets would be playing that music the following weekend. And by 1960, Brian realised it was a big mistake to be playing American, copying Americans' own music. He said, we're in Australia at the end of the 20th century. We should be developing our own sounds. We should be reflecting our own Australian culture. And from that time on, he composed all the music for his groups. And when he was appointed to the college in 1980, he said, this is the philosophy of the course, that we try to develop our own voice. It was called Improvisation Studies. It's Jazz Studies. It began in 1980 as Jazz Studies, and he changed the title to Improvisation Studies in 1988 because he said it was not the usual instruments. There were students auditioning and getting accepted on French horn and bassoon and harp. So it was called Improvisation Studies. It eventually amalgamated with the University of Melbourne, and it's now called it's the Bachelor of it's Jazz and Improvisation Studies, but it's a standalone one, and it is a unique course in Australia. Now, Brian and Garry first met in Wangaratta in 1994, and the story of their meeting is very interesting. Brian was playing at his group was at the Wangaratta Jazz Festival, and next door Garry had an exhibition, and at the centre of it was an extraordinary instrument called the Windform. Now, we went into that. I have to explain my knowledge of all of this, is that Brian is my late husband, but so we went in next door to the gallery, and there on the floor was this extraordinary instrument. It's called Windform, and it's 6.5 metres long or so. It is huge. You'll see the mountain harp in the corner of the picture, the right-hand picture, and that's getting close to 1 metre. So you can imagine how enormous this Windform is. Slim at the beginning, and then it ends up in that glorious, glorious bell. When it's normally played, it's on the floor. Here, sensibly, they've put it up, hung it from the rafters so people could walk around. But when it's on the floor, it's propped up by slim metal stands. Now, there it was on the floor in all its beautiful curves, and people were lining up to play it. And there were little kids and older people, and a whole group of people were playing it and having a go at it too. Well, they were making the most horrible sounds. There were farts and blops and burps, and you can't imagine how horrible the sounds were. Well, Brian, being a saxophone player, got up when it was his turn and produced this most stunning sound for about 7 seconds, at which Garry, who was sitting in the corner, leapt to his feet and rushed over to see who was playing. Saw Brian, said, I love your music. I heard you yesterday and thought it was fantastic. And Brian said, I love your art. And so then Brian asked Garry if he would make him an instrument. And that resulted in a collaboration that has pushed the boundaries of Australian intermediate arts through the production of unique sounds. Here is the bowhorn that Garry made Brian. It took 3 months to make, and the basic construction was completed then. It's made from a long, slim, wedge-shaped leather piece rolled into a tube with the sides glued together. Garry used no stitching in anything that he made. It was all wet-formed leather, and it just overlaps and is glued together. And he put extra layers on, which you can see, like an arum lily, many, many layers to make it absolutely rigid so that when it was played, it wouldn't move at all. Now, the outer curve length is 152 centimetres and the inner curve is 128 centimetres. And the bell, which has got that look of an arum lily, the opening is about 18 centimetres. So to set the tuning, Brian went to Launceston and worked with Garry for a 10-hour day. Garry had placed 10 finger holes, 9 on the face and a thumb hole at the back, over 30 centimetres of the barrel. Brian covered 7 of the finger holes that suited his hands, and with the other holes, Garry simply cut up little pieces of leather, filed them flat and glued them in place. And today you can see them and they look like scar tissue. Well, then Brian blew the first note, which must have been an amazing experience. It was approximately an A, which then became the fundamental. He selected another 8 using the cross fingering that's usual for wind instruments. And then these were the notes he selected. Looking at the bass clef, A, D, E flat, E, and A, B, C, D, E flat. The scale was selected because it suited his compositional style, and Brian's music had the rhythmic momentum of African American music, and incorporated a large amount of improvisation. So the blues quality of the selected notes seemed likely to provide appropriate melodic sounds. Brian took the instrument back to Melbourne and he began a systematic practice schedule of 50 hours before he would play it publicly. And immediately he discovered an overtone series so great it was possible to play melodies just amongst those notes. And you can see the overtones. Just even on the A, there are 6 overtones. 4, most of them have got 4 overtones, so it gives an enormous range. He also discovered the bowhorn could produce glissandi without moving his fingers if he used a particular embouchure and throat manipulation, and it gave him a far greater variety of tone than any instrument he'd ever known. Here's the range. The lowest register, the sounds are from bass clarinet and with adjusted throat and embouchure didgeridoo sounds. In the middle register, the lowest note sounds like a bassoon, and the upper note of the middle register, a C melody saxophone. And in the upper register, it was a synthesis of trumpet and soprano saxophone. But Brian found the instrument's unique sounds by playing the overtone series of the fundamental A with all the holes closed. And this is how he described the sound. You must be wondering what it's going to sound like. Well, you'll hear in a minute. He described the sound as a kind of screaming wail, but not sad. It can be really aggressive, but it can also produce a soft, haunting sound. And this variety, he said, gave the instrument substantial potential for personalised expression. I'm going to play a piece to you now called Bowhorn in Space. This was the very first piece that was ever recorded, and it is crazy. He had a wonderful quartet at the time. Sue Johnson on keyboard, who's very well known from Coco's Lunch. Scott Dunbabin playing his own SD1 bass, as in Scott Dunbabin, and Alex Pertu, multiple percussion. And Peter Gretsch was brought in for the to add the synthesizer. So here we go, crazy, crazy, Bowhorn in Space. Bowhorn in space. I remember driving along one day and listening to it. It was being played on the ABC, and I nearly drove off the road. I was laughing so hard at the sound, especially the last two notes. I think they're absolutely wonderful. In reflecting on the conference theme, Music Nourish Life, if ever this theme was in practice, we've seen it in Garry's work in producing unique art forms and Brian's constant striving for new sounds. And between them, they provided a rare and exciting musical understanding in Australian creative practice and research. I'm going to end with one more track. It's titled Garry Greenwood, and it's from one of two CDs that Brian devoted to solo bowhorn. Now, I am playing the synthesizer with it, and it's a free improvisation over a tonal structure. And my directions were to play anything I liked on an A minor chord, a B minor chord, D minor, and E minor. Up and down the keyboards, any registration, whatever I wanted to do, because Brian was keeping in mind the notes of those chords. So it's a lovely piece of music dedicated to Garry Greenwood. It is a most powerful lament. It is really the only way to describe this, a lament for a great artist, Garry Greenwood. Calais Garry Greenwood. Thank you.
Thanks, Ros. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. So interesting to be reminded again about the leather instruments, and I hope a few people will have a look and listen. Maybe they'll see Karlin in person sometime. Those instruments are just incredible. I've seen quite a few of them myself as well. So thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.